In the chaos of World War II, armies clashed across Europe, tanks roared, and artillery fire shook the ground. Yet amid the destruction and brutality, there existed a different kind of battlefield. A world of illusion, deception, and creative ingenuity. This was the world of the Ghost Army, a top-secret Allied unit tasked with one mission: to mislead the enemy and save lives without firing a single real shot. The Ghost Army was not a typical military unit. It was composed of artists, designers, engineers, and soldiers, selected not only for their combat abilities, but for their creativity, imagination, and understanding of perception. Their mission was simple in theory, but complex in execution. Make the enemy believe a vast, powerful force was present where, in reality, there was only an illusion. Inflatable tanks, sound effects, dummy artillery, fake headquarters, and even entire phantom divisions became their tools of war. The story begins in early 1944. The Allies were preparing for the liberation of Europe, planning large-scale operations that would require misdirection to succeed. Commanders understood that in war, appearances could be as lethal as bullets. If the enemy could be made to concentrate forces in the wrong place, entire divisions could advance with less resistance, saving thousands of lives. It was a concept that required ingenuity, precision, and absolute secrecy. Formation of the Ghost Army was authorized under the codename 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The unit recruited individuals from unlikely backgrounds: art school graduates, architects, theatrical set designers, and sound engineers, alongside traditional soldiers. Each brought a unique skill set, from painting realistic camouflage to building inflatable tanks that looked convincing even from aerial reconnaissance. Some of the soldiers had never fired a gun in combat. Their weapon was illusion itself. Training was intensive and highly specialized. The soldiers learned how to create realistic visual effects that could fool enemy scouts from miles away. They practiced assembling inflatable tanks and trucks in record time, sometimes under harsh weather conditions, to simulate combat readiness. Sound units were equally sophisticated. Recordings of troop movements, artillery fire, and vehicle engines were played on massive speakers, creating the impression of an entire division advancing or preparing for an attack. Radio operators transmitted false messages, imitating commands and logistical communications to reinforce the deception. The unit was small compared to the real divisions they imitated. A single Ghost Army squad could represent thousands of troops by strategically placing decoys and controlling the flow of information. Their operations required precise timing, coordination, and an acute understanding of psychology, how the enemy would perceive, interpret, and react to their illusions. Mistakes could be catastrophic, as exposure of the deception might lead to direct confrontation and casualties. Secrecy was paramount. Even most Allied commanders outside the unit were unaware of its existence. The Ghost Army's missions were classified at the highest levels, and the soldiers were sworn to silence, knowing that their success relied on remaining invisible not just to the enemy, but often to their own allies. Diaries, sketches, and reports were kept under strict lock, and the true scale of their operations would remain hidden from public knowledge for decades. Despite these challenges, the Ghost Army began to prove its effectiveness almost immediately. Early exercises tested their ability to mislead reconnaissance aircraft and patrols. Inflatable Sherman tanks, painted with realistic details and positioned across hills and open fields, caused enemy intelligence to report entire armored divisions in places where none existed. Sound recordings of marching troops and artillery fire, synchronized with visual decoys, created illusions so convincing that German commanders diverted forces in response. The soldiers themselves faced unique hardships. Unlike traditional units, they were constantly on the move, setting up and dismantling illusions in the middle of enemy territory. They worked long hours in freezing weather or sweltering heat, knowing that any misstep could reveal their ruse. Camouflage paint, inflated rubber vehicles, and loudspeakers were heavy, awkward, and fragile under combat conditions. Yet the Ghost Army persevered, learning to improvise and adapt, turning art and imagination into effective military strategy. By the time the unit was fully deployed in Europe, they had refined a repertoire of techniques that combined visual, auditory, and radio deception into coordinated operations. The Phantom divisions became legends among those who saw them. Planes spotted massive troop movements, only to report empty fields. Enemy officers believed themselves outnumbered and repositioned their forces, often unknowingly abandoning key positions. The Ghost Army was invisible to history for decades, yet its impact on the outcome of operations was undeniable. The origins of the Ghost Army reveal a fundamental truth about war. Victory is not won solely by firepower or numbers, but by ingenuity, creativity, and the ability to shape perception. This was a unit that blurred the line between art and warfare, demonstrating that deception, when executed with precision and imagination, could be as lethal as any weapon on the battlefield. The Ghost Army's brilliance lay not in brute force, but in illusion. They transformed the ordinary into extraordinary, turning rubber, canvas, and sound into a weapon that could fool the most experienced enemy commanders. To the casual observer, their work seemed simple, but the execution required precision, timing, and an artistic eye. Every shadow, every sound, every movement had to be convincing enough to survive scrutiny from both ground reconnaissance and the air. One of the most iconic tools of the Ghost Army was the inflatable tank. These life-sized replicas of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and artillery pieces were constructed from rubber and canvas and painted to mimic the wear and tear of actual combat vehicles. When positioned strategically on hills, in open fields, or along roads, they created the impression of entire armored divisions ready to advance. From the air, these decoys were virtually indistinguishable from the real thing. Even careful aerial reconnaissance photographs, once studied by German analysts, reported armored concentrations that simply did not exist. The soldiers also mastered dummy artillery and vehicles made from wood, rubber, and canvas. These could be rapidly assembled or dismantled, allowing the Ghost Army to create the illusion of sudden troop deployments or reinforcements. Inflatable trucks, fake fuel dumps, and decoy artillery batteries could be moved under cover of night to simulate the arrival of additional forces. By the time enemy observers were aware of their presence, the Ghost Army had already vanished, leaving behind only the illusion of power. But visual deception was only part of the strategy. The unit developed an entire arsenal of sound-based tricks, known as sonic deception. Soldiers used large amplifiers and speakers to play recordings of marching troops, artillery fire, and engine noises. These sounds were carefully synchronized with the placement of visual decoys, convincing the enemy that entire divisions were maneuvering across the landscape. The recordings were surprisingly realistic. Engine sounds varied, footsteps echoed across fields, and artillery bursts were timed with precise intervals, all designed to simulate real combat activity. Radio deception was another critical component. Operators transmitted false messages to imitate command communications, supply requests, and logistical reports. These transmissions, combined with visual and auditory illusions, reinforced the impression of a fully operational unit. German intelligence intercepted these broadcasts, believing them to be genuine, and often redirected forces in response to the Phantom Army's apparent movements. It was a game of perception, where every intercepted message or observed movement was a carefully calculated lie. The Ghost Army also incorporated camouflage and battlefield artistry into their work. Soldiers painted realistic shadows, tire tracks, and footprints to make decoys appear as if they had been occupied for days. They added environmental details like makeshift sandbags or discarded equipment to create the impression of living, breathing units. Attention to these small details ensured that the deception survived close scrutiny, including by ground patrols that occasionally ventured near the fake installations. Improvisation was a key skill. Weather conditions, terrain, and enemy behavior required constant adaptation. Rain could deflate or damage the rubber tanks, while wind could scatter equipment and give away their presence. Soldiers learned to anchor inflatables securely, paint realistic mud and wear on dummy vehicles, and camouflage sound equipment so it remained hidden. They trained rigorously to respond quickly to any threat of discovery, dismantling illusions in minutes and moving to a new location to continue the deception. The unit also perfected timing and coordination. A single decoy tank or sound effect would not suffice. The Ghost Army needed to simulate the movement of entire divisions, sometimes numbering thousands of troops. Operations were planned meticulously, with synchronized deployment of inflatables, sound effects, and radio transmissions. A convincing illusion required careful pacing, engines starting in sequence, troops marching at realistic intervals, and artillery firing at timed patterns to create the sense of preparation for attack. Even reconnaissance photography was accounted for. Soldiers would construct dummy headquarters and position decoy units in areas likely to be photographed from the air. Inflatable tanks were sometimes arranged in patterns visible only from above, ensuring that any aerial surveillance would reinforce the illusion. In some cases, fake bridges, vehicles, and campsites were added to make an area appear heavily fortified, influencing enemy decision-making without a single real soldier present. The creativity extended beyond the battlefield. Some soldiers brought theatrical skills, creating illusionary troop movements that mimicked unit drills and formations. Shadows, flags, and silhouettes were manipulated to give the impression of activity even at dusk or dawn. Sound engineers experimented with echoing footsteps or overlapping recordings of engines to make single decoy vehicles seem like entire convoys. Every technique was a blend of science and art, designed to exploit perception and psychology as much as military strategy. The impact of these techniques was profound. German forces frequently diverted troops, delayed attacks, or misallocated resources in response to the Ghost Army's illusions. Entire divisions believed themselves outnumbered, while real Allied units advanced elsewhere with less resistance. The Ghost Army did not fire a single real shot in many operations, yet their work directly influenced the outcome of battles and helped save countless lives. Through a combination of inflatable vehicles, sound effects, radio deception, camouflage artistry, and theatrical skill, the Ghost Army turned imagination into a weapon. Their methods were never intended to replace conventional forces, but to enhance strategic advantage, creating opportunities for real troops to exploit and succeed. It was a unique form of warfare, blending creativity with tactical precision and demonstrating that in war, perception can be as powerful as firepower. The soldiers themselves understood the stakes. Each operation required confidence in their craft and the courage to work in exposed areas, knowing that discovery could lead to real danger. Yet for every successful illusion, the Ghost Army proved that unconventional thinking and creativity could rival tanks and artillery on the battlefield. Their techniques would remain a remarkable example of ingenuity in warfare, studied decades later as a testament to the power of deception, coordination, and human resourcefulness. By 1944, the Ghost Army was ready for deployment. Its soldiers, trained in deception, camouflage, and psychological tactics, were assigned to several crucial operations across the European theater. Their work was invisible to most, yet it played a decisive role in misdirecting the enemy, allowing real Allied units to advance with less opposition. These operations demonstrated the units' creativity, courage, and the practical application of their unique skills. One of the earliest major assignments occurred during the lead-up to Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Allied command recognized the need to mislead German forces about the exact location of the landings. The Ghost Army's mission was to simulate a massive force near Pas-de-Calais, hundreds of miles from the actual invasion beaches. Inflatable tanks, dummy artillery, and fake supply depots were positioned along likely enemy observation routes, while sound units played recordings of troop movements, engine noise, and simulated artillery fire. From the air, the illusion was complete. German reconnaissance aircraft reported the presence of armored divisions that did not exist. Commanders in Berlin, interpreting the intelligence, diverted troops to defend against the Phantom Army. Meanwhile, real Allied forces advanced in Normandy with less resistance than might have been expected. The success of this deception helped establish the effectiveness of the Ghost Army and cemented its reputation as a unit capable of shaping battlefield outcomes without direct combat. The unit's operations were not limited to deception on a grand scale. Smaller missions often involved creating illusions to protect advancing troops, cover retreats, or confuse local enemy detachments. In some cases, decoy units were positioned in open fields, while actual forces moved silently along parallel roads. The synchronization between visual decoys, sound effects, and radio transmissions required meticulous planning. Any misstep could reveal the deception, so precision and timing were critical. Perhaps the most ambitious operation took place during the Battle of the Bulge, when the Germans launched a surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest. The Allies faced the threat of being overrun, and diversion became essential. The Ghost Army was deployed to simulate reinforcement units in multiple locations. Inflatable tanks and trucks were strategically positioned to suggest that large armored divisions were arriving. Sound effects of engine noise, troop movements, and artillery simulated preparation for a counterattack. Radio operators transmitted false logistical messages to reinforce the illusion. The results were dramatic. German reconnaissance and intelligence units believed they faced well-prepared and fully reinforced Allied divisions. Confused by reports of massive troop concentrations, they hesitated and redirected resources away from the real front lines. This hesitation gave actual Allied forces time to regroup, organize, and launch counterattacks that eventually stopped the German advance. The Ghost Army had once again altered the course of battle without firing a shot. Another remarkable operation occurred in the Rhineland, where the Ghost Army's task was to protect advancing infantry and tanks by simulating the presence of additional divisions along critical roads and river crossings. Inflatable tanks were deployed on hilltops, fake artillery positions appeared along open fields, and sound units played recordings that suggested troop movements in preparation for a major assault. Enemy forces observing the decoys were led to believe that they faced overwhelming numbers, prompting them to withdraw or delay engagement. The soldiers often worked under extremely difficult conditions. In France and Germany, they had to move equipment quickly over muddy roads, through forests and across rivers, all while remaining undetected. Rain, wind, and cold threatened the fragile inflatables and delicate sound equipment. Every operation required careful planning and improvisation. Soldiers learned to anchor decoys securely, camouflage sound speakers, and maintain the illusion despite environmental challenges. The creativity of the Ghost Army extended beyond simple visual tricks. In some operations, phantom headquarters were constructed to suggest that entire divisions had established command posts. Inflatable vehicles, tents, and dummy personnel were positioned to be visible from aerial reconnaissance. Officers' silhouettes and shadows were painted or staged to enhance realism. Combined with sound effects and false radio traffic, these operations created the impression of a fully operational, heavily armed force where none existed. One particularly audacious mission involved simulating a large Allied force in Alsace to cover the real movement of troops preparing to cross the Rhine. Inflatable tanks and vehicles were placed in fields and forests, while sound units broadcasted the hum of engines and the march of troops. Radio operators sent false reports of logistics and supply movements. German intelligence believed they were facing a major force, and commanders adjusted their deployments accordingly. The operation succeeded in diverting enemy attention and contributed to the smooth advance of actual Allied units across the river. The Ghost Army's success was also due to the human element. Soldiers themselves became part of the illusion. They painted realistic dirt and wear on inflatables, staged dummy camps, and created footprints and tracks that mimicked large troop movements. They acted as decoy soldiers in positions that would be observed from afar, sometimes standing completely still to appear as sentries or machine gun teams. Every detail was designed to maintain the illusion under scrutiny from the enemy. Despite their creativity and careful planning, the Ghost Army constantly faced risk. Discovery could lead to direct engagement with German forces, and some operations brought them uncomfortably close to real battlefields. Yet their courage and discipline allowed them to perform under pressure. They became masters of improvisation, adjusting illusions on the fly when conditions or enemy behavior threatened to expose their deception. By the end of the European campaign, the Ghost Army had participated in dozens of critical operations. Their inflatables, sound effects, and radio deception had misled enemy forces countless times. Entire German divisions had been fooled into believing they faced overwhelming numbers, enabling real Allied forces to advance, regroup, or retreat safely. The unit's success demonstrated that innovation and strategy could achieve results often greater than sheer firepower. These operations also had a psychological impact. German commanders grew cautious and uncertain, unsure of whether reported troop movements represented real threats or phantom divisions. The presence of the Ghost Army instilled confusion and hesitation, buying valuable time for Allied forces and reducing casualties. Soldiers of the unit, though largely invisible to the public for decades, played an essential role in the outcome of the war through ingenuity, timing, and relentless commitment to their craft. The Ghost Army proved that warfare was not solely about the largest guns or the strongest tanks. It was about perception, creativity, and understanding the human mind. Their major operations, whether simulating armored divisions in Normandy, diverting attention in the Ardennes, or masking movements in the Rhineland, highlighted the power of imagination on the battlefield. Each successful illusion was a combination of artistry, engineering, and strategy, showing that deception could be one of the most effective weapons of all. For all their ingenuity, the soldiers of the Ghost Army faced constant challenges. Their operations required not only creativity and precision, but also courage under unpredictable and often dangerous conditions. While their decoys could fool enemy reconnaissance from afar, there was always the risk of discovery by German patrols, locals, or even Allied troops unfamiliar with the unit's unique mission. Every misstep could result in exposure, embarrassment, or even deadly confrontation. Weather was one of the Ghost Army's most persistent obstacles. Inflatable tanks and vehicles were vulnerable to rain, wind, and mud. A sudden storm could deflate rubber decoys, scatter dummy artillery, or make sound equipment malfunction. Soldiers learned to anchor inflatables with ropes and stakes, apply waterproof coatings, and camouflage equipment with tarps and natural foliage. Even with these precautions, a misjudged gust of wind could ruin hours of careful setup. Rain-soaked roads and muddy fields slowed transport and made it difficult to move decoys quickly. Yet timing was critical. Delays could compromise the illusion entirely. Another constant challenge was proximity to real combat. In some operations, the Ghost Army had to set up their illusions near active battle zones. Artillery fire, reconnaissance patrols, and unexpected enemy movements created high-stakes conditions. Soldiers often had to assemble decoys under fire or dismantle equipment while bullets or shells flew nearby. The line between illusion and reality was thin. One careless movement could reveal the ruse, leaving them vulnerable to attack. Human error also posed risks. Inflatable tanks that were improperly secured could topple or burst, revealing the deception. Sound recordings could malfunction, repeat incorrectly, or fail to sync with visual cues, tipping off enemy observers. Radio operators sometimes miscommunicated, accidentally sending inconsistent signals that could be intercepted and analyzed. Every soldier understood that even minor mistakes could jeopardize the mission and endanger lives. Despite meticulous training, the Ghost Army occasionally faced close calls with German forces. Patrols on the ground would sometimes approach decoy positions, suspicious of unusual shapes or movements. Soldiers had to think quickly, using improvisation to maintain the illusion. They might hide among decoys, remain perfectly still, or use quick camouflage to make dummy vehicles appear real. These moments were tense and nerve-wracking, demanding nerves of steel from individuals unaccustomed to direct combat. Logistics presented another challenge. Moving hundreds of inflatable tanks, wooden artillery, sound equipment, and decoy personnel across war-torn landscapes was a monumental task. Roads were often destroyed, bridges had been bombed, and supply lines were vulnerable to both enemy and environmental hazards. Soldiers had to transport delicate equipment while avoiding detection, sometimes over dozens of miles, all while maintaining secrecy. Every convoy required careful planning, and delays could compromise an operation's success. Sound operations, too, were complicated. Speakers had to be positioned so that the audio could carry realistically, without revealing the hidden source. Terrain, wind, and foliage could distort sound, forcing soldiers to experiment and adjust constantly. Improvisation was critical. Moving speakers, adjusting volume, or altering the timing of footsteps and engine noises could mean the difference between a convincing illusion and a failed deception. The human element added further complexity. Soldiers had to remain disciplined and focused under extreme stress, often working long hours with little rest. They endured cold nights, heat, fatigue, and hunger, all while performing intricate tasks requiring precision and creativity. Even minor lapses in concentration could lead to mistakes, compromising not only the illusion, but also their personal safety. One particularly tense incident occurred during a deployment in northern France, when German reconnaissance planes appeared unexpectedly. Soldiers scrambled to adjust inflatables and reposition sound equipment. For hours they worked in near silence, with enemy planes overhead capturing photographs and observing movements. Every decision had to be executed flawlessly to maintain the illusion. When the planes finally departed, the soldiers had successfully convinced the enemy that a large armored force occupied the area, an operation that could easily have ended in disaster. Close calls were not limited to enemy encounters. On occasion, Allied units unfamiliar with the Ghost Army stumbled upon decoys, almost triggering confusion or friendly fire. Soldiers had to carefully communicate and coordinate with other units to prevent accidents while preserving secrecy. These situations required diplomacy, patience, and split-second thinking, adding another layer of challenge to their already demanding work. Despite these dangers, the Ghost Army's soldiers developed remarkable resilience and improvisational skill. They learned to anticipate problems before they arose, adapt quickly to changing conditions, and maintain focus under pressure. Every successful mission reinforced their confidence and honed their expertise, while each close call offered lessons that improved future operations. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these challenges was the unit's ability to thrive despite constant pressure. They combined artistry, engineering, and tactical skill in an environment where the line between success and failure was razor-thin. Their close calls, far from undermining the mission, became opportunities to demonstrate ingenuity and resourcefulness. The Ghost Army's challenges highlighted a fundamental truth about deception in warfare. Creating illusions is not merely about technical skill, but about understanding perception, psychology, and the unpredictable nature of the battlefield. Every operation required coordination, creativity, and courage. The soldiers who performed these tasks, often invisible to the world for decades, exemplified the power of human ingenuity under extreme conditions. By the end of the war, the Ghost Army had faced countless challenges and narrowly avoided discovery many times, yet their efforts consistently succeeded. They demonstrated that deception, when executed with precision, timing, and courage, could achieve strategic outcomes that conventional firepower sometimes could not. Each close call, each obstacle overcome, underscored the extraordinary dedication and skill of a unit whose contributions remained secret for decades. When the war ended in 1945, the Ghost Army quietly faded from the battlefield. Their equipment was packed away, their records classified, and their stories left untold. For decades, almost no one outside the military knew they had even existed. The men returned home, blending into civilian life as artists, engineers, architects, and designers. Few spoke of what they had done in Europe, bound by secrecy and the quiet humility of those who knew the difference between illusion and reality. But their legacy endured. The techniques they pioneered, audio deception, inflatable decoys, and radio misdirection, would influence military strategy for generations. In Korea, Vietnam, and even in modern conflicts, the principles of visual and auditory deception continued to play a vital role. Their work became the blueprint for psychological and electronic warfare, proving that information, perception, and creativity could be as powerful as any weapon. In the decades that followed, historians and researchers began to uncover traces of their existence. Declassified documents revealed the full scale of their contribution: 20 operations, countless diversions, and thousands of lives potentially saved through their illusions. As the truth emerged, the Ghost Army soldiers were finally recognized not just as tricksters, but as pioneers who had reshaped the art of war itself. What made their story truly remarkable was that their weapon was not violence, it was imagination. Armed with paint, air pumps, and sound recordings, they created the illusion of force without destruction. They fought not with bullets, but with ideas. They showed that courage could exist not only on the front lines, but also in the shadows, where deception protected the truth. In 2022, after nearly 8 decades of secrecy, the U.S. government finally awarded the Ghost Army the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors. Veterans of the unit, many in their late 90s, gathered to receive the long-overdue recognition. For those who had spent a lifetime in silence, it was a moment of vindication, a public acknowledgement that their invisible war had made a visible difference. Their legacy continues beyond the military sphere. Artists, filmmakers, and writers have drawn inspiration from their story. Their blend of creativity and strategy challenges the conventional image of warfare and reminds us that innovation often emerges in the most unexpected places. The Ghost Army proved that art could save lives, that illusion could defend truth, and that imagination, in the face of destruction, could become a shield stronger than steel. The story of the Ghost Army is one of courage, innovation, and secrecy. They were artists who went to war, armed not with rifles but with creativity. In the chaos of World War II, they painted, inflated, and broadcasted illusions that turned the tide of battle. They saved lives without taking them, proving that deception, when wielded with intelligence and compassion, can be a force for good. For decades, their story remained hidden in classified files and faded photographs. Only recently have we come to understand the scale of their achievement and the humanity behind their deception. The Ghost Army reminds us that history is not only written by those who fight on the front lines, but also by those who think, design, and create in the background, those whose ideas change the course of events without ever firing a shot. Today, their story stands as a timeless reminder. The greatest strength of any nation lies not just in its armies or weapons, but in the creativity, courage, and imagination of its people.